Beat Reporters Without Borders was a very good space and a culture that I could really make a change in. It's a big international organization, and a person like me who comes from India, is a person of color, is a woman of color, being in a powerful position in a big organization like that changes things. So I think I was always open to learning. That was also one great value that I still have, and I love it when I'm talking to students and they're telling me something that I never knew. Basically, extreme leaderships where they're trying to basically propagate for people to follow one side. You see very biased news. You're not seeing a very factual, neutral piece of news or journalism as it was 20 years ago.
What is one thing you hope that people will remember you for?
Oh, very good question.
First of all, thank you so much for taking the time to be interviewed by the Media Club. Really appreciate it. So I'll jump right in, and I would like to ask you a bit more about your academic background and your relationship with learning.
For me, growing up in India, I did my basic schooling and my education in India, in North India actually, and then I went on to do a master's in human rights and social work. And I think because of my move towards doing a master's that was more focused on practical experience, I think I became very interested in working in the field. Because for me, even as a child, I think I was very eager always to learn new things and always also eager to find solutions. And I remember in my bachelor's, I did a very theoretical course, which was called sociology. And sociology for me just meant like I was reading a lot of theories and I didn't feel very full and I didn't feel complete. And I think that's why I went into a master's that was more hands-on. And that master's was actually a huge eye-opener for me. So in that course of that master's, we were actually placed in remote village locations around India. And I worked with underprivileged communities and tribal women. And that kind of made me understand the reason I always wanted to be in human rights. And I think also in that academic space, that was my first academic space where I was pushed to think critically, to start questioning authority, to start thinking that what's happening around us in the world is not exactly the way they're telling us, right? So I started questioning things a lot after my master's. And I think that's why, for me, my master's was a huge influence on what I did and what I do now. I did also study after that I did a course in Howard, so in US, and that was basically on how do you use storytelling and public narrative to create leadership in the community and to also kind of mobilize people towards a movement. And for me, that was also groundbreaking because I was in a place where professors really understood you and gave you time and also pushed you towards being good critical thinkers, because usually they're like, don't think critically, right? So for me, I think what has happened in the last 8 years after my education has been a huge influence because of wherever I have been.
Right. I think it's really interesting that you thought out your education so much and you analyzed what aspects resonated with you and what aspects you didn't feel fulfilled with.
Yes, that's a very good point actually. A lot of friends think that I was too wise for my age because I did a bachelor's and all of a sudden I realized I was not interested and I wanted to shift my scale. And at a young age, sometimes you might not know so much about you. And I think it's also because of the kind of family that I come from. So I come from a single mother family and I was more independent since I was a kid. So I think that allowed me more reflection of who I want to be, maybe.
That's really great. Right, so I wanted to ask how your academic journey and your personal values sort of coincide.
I think it goes back to the fact that it started coinciding when I started doing my master's. So I think before that, one thing I was always clear since I did my schooling and I finished my schooling in India was that I always wanted to be in the human rights space or a social work space, right? That was also because of the background I came from, where my family comes from. We come from a space in India which has seen conflict in the past, and I always wanted to work with community, to solve and to find solutions so that they could basically change their situations, because all of us should be allowed that choice to change who we are or where we are. And I always felt and believed in that. So I think one value where I always thought change can happen in people and I can bring that change was what drove me to basically even my personal values on choosing the people I surrounded myself with, the kind of courses I did. I think one thing I always did, which is a very good practice I realized later, is that I always found many multiple forms of information. For example, I was doing, let's say I am doing a job, right? But I am also doing an online internship or I'm doing an online course that's allowing me to gather more extra information that could just give me another skill that I need. Into learning, that was also one great value that I still have, and I love it when I'm talking to students and they're telling me something that I never knew and I'm excited about it.
Moving on to a little bit about your experience in journalism. I wanted you to share your experience as a member of Reporters Without Borders.
Sure. So I joined Reporters Without Borders 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. So there's a trajectory of how I even joined Reporters Without Borders. I was working in Afghanistan and then I had to leave. And then I was working with the EU Human Rights Defender project where we were getting a lot of journalists and a lot of human rights defenders like me out, of Afghanistan because they were not safe anymore. And I think of having been in that field, having been a human rights defender myself, I felt like Reporters Without Borders was a very good space and a culture that I could really make a change in. It's a big international organization, and a person like me who comes from India, is a person of color, is a woman of color, being in a powerful position in a big organization like that changes things for you. And so for me, it's always been like that. Like one of the values for me is also to be in influential positions where I can actually make change, because ultimately power is everything, right? Even if people take it as a negative, but women and people who are coming from underprivileged backgrounds should have power in important spaces. And I think RSF has allowed me to do that. I joined the headquarters in Paris in 2022, and then I moved to Taiwan for the Asia Pacific Bureau office. And basically what I do with RSF is I am programming and implementing their projects on training journalists on how to keep themselves safe. So especially in conflict and especially in authoritarian regions, right? How can you basically keep yourself safe from censorship, from a lot of other activities that the government usually puts against journalists. So things like that. I'm also providing emergency assistance support through RSF. So if, let's say, a journalist was in danger and has to leave the country, my job at RSF is to get them out and is to basically protect them and safeguard them. So I kind of really feel good about the kind of work I'm doing at RSF. In terms of journalism, what I really like about RSF is that it's not journalism in the way that it's defined. We're not writing articles, we're not writing reports or journalistic piece of work, but we're actually doing solutions-based journalism. So we're protecting the journalists. We're protecting that the journalism don't die. We're protecting the aspect of press freedom around the world. And that somehow gives me more satisfaction because it's more action-oriented, right? I did do some journalism when I was back home in India. It was always a career path that my parents never wanted me to take because they understood that it's very difficult and it could bring a lot of danger, and it did bring a lot of problems and situations for me when I was in India. So I understand that it has its problems and disadvantages, but I still feel that if more organizations like RSF could protect journalists, then there could be more and more of us.
Thank you so much. I think we can all say without a doubt that the work you're doing with RSF and outside is very impactful.
Thank you.
Okay. So what are some of the most challenges that you've faced so far under that role?
That's a good question. I think because I've been in different countries and I've done different nature of work, sometimes the challenges have been very related to the work I did. So in India, when I was working in remote villages in conflict and I was writing certain piece of news, which was almost always contradicting the authorities' point of view, right? And then I would start getting letters. And I think this happened more and more in the last 10 years. One major challenge that I've faced is because I am a person who travels outside the country a lot, and now I have residency here in Taiwan. So whenever I'm going back home to India to visit my family, the immigration office is always asking me a lot more questions than a usual person. I am always in, living in this fear that one day they might just not allow me to leave the country. So there are, of course, repercussions to all of this. Of course, I'm trying to create a shield around me where I always travel with the right papers. I always travel with every other legal paper because what I have faced as a person of color, especially having an Indian passport, is that we are questioned more usually than other people whenever we're traveling anywhere. Like I travel to Paris a lot and I'm always treated differently at immigration. So those are the challenges I also face because of the descent I come from. And from my work, it's mostly in my country or in other countries. Like for example, I'm working a lot on China right now. And in Taiwan, even though Taiwan is considered very safe at the moment, we have had faced phishing attacks. We've faced some alerts and attacks over emails on our social media profiles, right? So this work always comes with challenges. What I've realized is not to focus on them so that I stay positive and I keep going on.
So, what are your thoughts on the current global media landscape?
I think it's definitely getting bad. There's a very hopeless side of it, but then there's also a very hopeful side of it. I would say that because there's more and more authoritarianism that's increasing, right? More and more countries are moving towards dictatorship, are moving towards right wing leadership, basically extreme leaderships, where they're trying to basically propagate for people to follow one side. What's happening with the media is because media is also getting privatized, you see very biased news. You're not seeing a very factual, neutral piece of news or journalism as it was 20 years ago, maybe, right? And so there's definitely more dangers of the way we consume media. There's more form of media. There's social media. There's other platforms now that where you can easily access information. And this is what we're discussing in our class every day, is that how important it is that we should be media literate. I mean, not just because we're journalists or want to be journalists. Every citizen needs media literacy because you are consuming information at an alarming rate these days, right? So that's one disadvantage that I see, and a huge hopeless situation kind of a thing. But in this, the hopeful thing that I see is that there are still journalists, there are still human rights defenders, there are still a lot of organizations that are working against it. They're working against the narrative. They're trying to fight that narrative, trying to bring out the true thing, the true information, trying to always fight the situation as it is. And I think one good thing would be if more resources in terms of funding and financial resources can be diverted to certain organizations which are actually fighting this kind of misinformation right now. So there has to be a balance. There is a huge disinformation right now, but then there has to be more platforms and resources fighting this disinformation. That's what I think.
Right. Okay, so moving on to your role as an educator as well as your goals, I wanted to ask you, what does being an educator mean to you personally?
That's a good question. I actually never imagined myself as an educator. I imagined myself being in the field, reporting, working. But as an educator, what I've realized in the past few weeks, especially being here with you guys in Ming, is that it opened my eyes to a lot of new realities. I think what happens many times is that as individuals, we put ourselves in these boxes or echo chambers of information, right? Where you feel like you have enough information, you know everything you know, right? But as an educator, what I've realized is in the process of preparing for you guys or for your class, I'm learning a lot that I would have never learned if I would have never taught this class, right? So I'm learning with you guys in every class when you're sharing different situations of different countries and what's happening. And one person does not have the ability to know everything. And what's humbling is that I agree that I don't know everything. So that's humbling for me. And the fact that I'm more open to learn from all the students. And it also is empowering for me to feel that I have a class of 45 students and there is maybe one student I can change, So the fact that I have that power to even change one student in that class is very humbling and empowering for me. So thank you to you guys.
Sure. So, although it sort of relates to the previous question, what is one of your main goals as an educator right now?
I think one of the main goals is, as I said, to basically get younger students or people who are in my class to become more critical. I think that's always been going to be my aim as an educator. And it's not just because if we are doing a journalism course or we're doing media literacy, in every aspect of our life. So for me, the goal would be that every student in this class, by the end of it, becomes so critical that they question everything that comes across. So that's my goal.
Okay. And what's one goal of yours outside of teaching that you feel comfortable sharing with us?
That's a good point. So I started my own organization a few years ago that I've been running on the side with my work at RSF. And I think one personal goal and it's a women's rights organization that works with women in conflict. And what I would like to do personally in the next few years is really grow this organization transnationally. So be based in different locations, having different young women working with the organization, and that I have enough funding sources to be able to basically sustain and pay these young women because they need more sources of places and empowerment. So that's one goal, definitely. Yeah, to be able to be my own boss and run my own organization. Yes.
So now on to a more personal reflection or reflecting aspect. If you could gain a new skill or talent, what would it be for you?
I think this is a good question because I was just thinking about it yesterday. I would like to learn swimming. I realized how important that is. I mean, I've done scuba diving, I've done all of those things, and they said that you can do it without swimming. But I've realized I've seen people who know swimming as a skill, and I've seen how sometimes good can it be for you, to be in the water and be comfortable in the water. So I think that's one skill I really want to learn.
That's really interesting. I didn't expect you to say
Yeah,
that.
you did? Okay. Maybe I should have said something profound in the beginning. I'm thinking. But swimming is something I really need to learn.
And lastly, what is one thing you hope that people will remember you for?
Oh, very good question. I don't know. Maybe I would like them to remember me as a person who created some kind of a change in the society and that ultimately helped bringing society to a better place rather than the opposite.
I think I've realized that you hold yourself to a very high standard with a lot of expectations. I mean, even from when you were talking about your education, one of the values that you mentioned was trying to incorporate change in everything that you do, which is a lot of pressure. So I think that's something that's really admirable about you.
Thank you for observing that. A lot of people in just talking to me don't observe that. So thank you.
No problem. Thank you so much for sitting with us today.
No problem at all. Thank you so much, Nakija. I think we can end it.